Throughout October, the war was very active, to say the least, with action in the west, the east, the Italian front, Serbia, and Salonika. But for once, it's about to get a little bit calmer, as this week, 3 major battles come to an end. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Italian and French offensives continued. The Russians used new tactics to stop the Germans, and the three-pronged invasion of Serbia continued, with desperate fighting often hand-to-hand. We also looked a little bit at the situation at Gallipoli, where Charles Monro had taken charge of the British and Anzac forces. On October 30th, Monro visited Cape Helles, Anzac, and Suvla the same day to get a feel for Gallipoli, and this is what he had to say about it all. The positions occupied by our troops presented a military situation unique in history. The mere fringe of the coastline had been secured. The beaches and piers upon which they depended for all requirements in personnel and material were exposed to registered and observed artillery fire. Our entrenchments were dominated almost throughout by the Turks. The possible artillery positions were insufficient and ineffective. The force, in short, held a line possessing every possible military defect. The position was without depth. The communications were insecure and dependent on the weather. No means existed for the concealment and deployment of fresh troops destined for the offensive, whilst the Turks enjoyed full powers of observation, abundant artillery positions, and they had been given the time to supplement the natural advantages which the position presented by all the devices at the disposal of the field engineer. Big words. Monro thought that since their continued presence on the peninsula had no purpose, he urged evacuation. But the ground was shifting under everyone's feet. Secretary of State for War Lord Kitchener was really obsessed with the idea of not hurting British prestige in the Islamic world, which he thought evacuation would do. So it was decided that Monro's advice was not to be trusted, and Kitchener would go to Gallipoli himself to check out the situation. Actually, Kitchener even came up with a plan on November 4th for a new landing at Bulair, while the Navy would try to break through the straits. He even went so far as to dispatch a telegram transferring Monro to Salonika and placing his second-in-command, Lieutenant General William Birdwood, in charge. Birdwood suppressed that order pending Kitchener's arrival at Gallipoli, which was a good thing because within a few hours, Kitchener had changed his mind about the whole thing. Seriously, Gallipoli gets crazier and more depressing all the time. There were also depressing developments on the war's newest front this week, those in Serbia. Here's a quote from the Chronology of the Great War about the progress in Serbia. The Austro-Germans in their progress distinguished themselves by their calculated brutality to the civilian population. It had the direct military object of causing a wholesale panic in order to encumber the few roads with fleeing households and thereby to impede the retreat of the Serbian army and guns. The two Serbian armies were by now hopelessly isolated by the Bulgarian advance from Uskub toward Pristina. The northern one retired towards Montenegro and the southern into the mountains of central Albania. And on November 5th, a milestone moment happened when Bulgarian troops captured Niš, which finally gave the Germans a direct railway line from Berlin all the way to Constantinople. That link would be formally opened by the Kaiser himself in a couple of months. But I mentioned earlier that 3 battles ended this week, so let's look at them. On the Italian front, the third battle of the Isonzo River ended. 20,000 Italian soldiers had been killed in 3 weeks and another 60,000 wounded. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the ratio of wounded to dead was higher on the Italian front than the others because the terrain was so rocky that bullets would ricochet and splinter the rock, causing far more injuries than usual, especially to eyes and faces. There would be no Italian breakthrough this time, much like the last 2 tries at the Isonzo. The Austro-Hungarian forces had controlled the high ground overlooking the river and had watched the Italian preparations the whole time. Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna had spread his forces along the whole line, rather than concentrate them against the main target, Gorizia, going so far as to even attack secure Austrian bridgeheads at Plezzo and Tolmino. Austro-Hungarian General Svetozar Borojevic von Bonya's defense was well organized, though when he counterattacked, his casualty rate was also heavy. Hey, here's a side note. I read that Borojević's troops had a nickname for him, the Croatian Thickhead. I guess they were not his biggest fans. Still though, he was one of the Empire's most capable field commanders, and as we've seen over the past year, the Empire needed all of those it could get. Okay, that's one battle over, and the other two that ended this week were both on the Western Front and were both French offensives. The Third Battle of Artois ended November 4th, and the Second Battle of Champagne ended the 6th. French casualties for Champagne were around 145,000 men, with the Germans taking about half that. If you look at Artois and Loos, where the British had mounted their own offensive, there were nearly 50,000 more French casualties there, for a total of 200,000 French casualties, around 60,000 British. So more than 250,000 Allied casualties against roughly about 120,000 total German casualties in the combined offensives. The French had advanced, at the cost of all those casualties, about 4 kilometers. And since they had, on just the Champagne front, fired nearly 3 million field artillery and over 500,000 heavy artillery shells, they were now basically out of shells. French General Joseph Joffre claimed that the offensives had resulted in important tactical gains and achieved a moral victory over the Germans, whatever that means. But John Keegan, in the First World War, points out that Loos and Champagne, in strategic terms, were pointless, and that for all of the continuing bravery of the French soldier or the determination of the new British soldiers to prove their mettle, nobody gained more than a handful of kilometers of territory. And in Champagne, the German second line was not penetrated, even with casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Keegan writes, "It had been a doleful year for the Allies on the Western Front. Much blood spilt for little gain, and any prospect of success postponed until 1916. The Germans had shown they had learned much about defending an entrenched front. The Allies that they had learned nothing about means of breaking through. It was a bitter lesson for the French, all the more so because in a widening war, their allies seemed bent on seeking solutions elsewhere, leaving the main body of the enemy implanted in their territory. Yet, the defeat of the enemy through victories outside France looked no closer a prospect than breakthrough towards the Rhine. In Russia, on the new Italian front, in the Balkans, on the Turkish battleground, the course of events favored the enemy." It was true. I mean, at sea and in the distant colonies, the Allies had the advantage. But how was that going to win them the war when they seemed to be losing everywhere else? The answer is obvious. It wasn't. Sure, there were bright spots, like over on the Eastern Front this week. Russians took 8,000 prisoners in Galicia on October 30th, and 5,000 more November 3rd as well. And Russian tactics last week had stopped the German advance, and Riga still seemed to be fairly safely in Russian hands. And here's another random note to round out the week. On October 31st, British troops began to use steel helmets. So that was the week. Some Russian successes and a bunch of Austro-Hungarian prisoners, more chaos and stupidity at Gallipoli, the Bulgarians, Germans, and Austrians rampaging through Serbia, menacing the local population, and major battles ending on the Italian front, in Artois, and in Champagne. 20,000, 45,000, 200,000. At this point, the death toll is so mechanical that it almost seems to lose meaning. But I'll bet a lot of you live in cities or towns with less than 250,000 inhabitants. So imagine if every single person in your town died in a matter of weeks. That's what kind of death we're looking at in Champagne. They didn't disappear, they died, meaning that their bodies remained, rotting or freezing as per the season. In this war, this happens every week, every month, all over Europe. So go outside and look at your town and imagine every last person there dead. Their blackened and torn corpses littering the ground, the buildings just burnt out shells. Welcome to modern war. The people who did witness these horrors were forever changed, and some of them wrote books to process what they witnessed. One of those was Louis Barthas, a French soldier who fought virtually the entire war. You can find our biography episode about him right here. And if you want to read his diaries, check out our Amazon store where you can buy it and support our show at the same time. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Jean-Francois Soucy. Thanks to him and our other Patreon supporters, we were able to improve our animation, so consider supporting us on Patreon too. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.